what I want to point out here is the concept of material selection and acquiring materials. There are things you have to do at the same time. You might find that you don't have available what it is you really would like to make a chuck box out of. That happens to me all the time, and I manufacture these things for a living. And believe me, the hardest part of my job is getting good, consistent material from one time to the next. Sometimes you go down there and they have a whole shelf of exactly what you need. The next time you go down there and everything in that shelf is bowed, twisted, warped, and contorted. And I suspect you might find you have exactly the same situation where you live. Now, some of the things I'm going to show you, I know you cannot necessarily get in different parts of the country or even different parts of the world. So what you have to do is you have to use your own mentality to try to figure out what the best approach would be. Now, to that end, if there's one thing I can impress upon you, it would be that when you're building chuck boxes, you want it to be a proposition that's more closely resembles building an airplane than building a house or even a cabinets for the house. This is the way most chuck boxes get built. Nowadays, if you get on YouTube and you start looking at all the stuff that people build out there, they have one underlying problem, at least 95% of them do, and that is they're too big. They use materials that are too heavy, and they also, the box themselves are just too big. Another thing I'd point out to you is that as your box goes up in size, let's say you go from a box this big to double that. Well, you've done more than just double the weight. The weight is actually going to go up probably exponentially, in other words, by a factor of 4. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that in order to build something bigger, you generally have to have heftier materials. And the second is that once you get it built, you're going to be able to get twice as much stuff in it. Therefore, it's going to be 4 times heavier. So, you really have to scrutinize this stuff. Now, in this book, I've kind of already done that for you. If you're building from this book, these products have all been, I'm going to say, honed down to manageable sizes. If you're building from this book, that means you're going to be basically trying to come up with your own chuck box. You still need to employ that mentality, though. You have to think more like building an airplane than it is like building a house. To me, when we're selecting materials, there's really 4 things we're trying to acquire. We want to get materials that are lightweight. We want material to be strong. We want materials that look good. And we want inexpensive materials. No sense spending any more than we have to do this. Now, unfortunately, those traits all tend to be mutually exclusive, which means things that are lightweight don't also tend to be strong. And things that look good don't also tend to be inexpensive. You get the idea. So we have to balance those traits. We have to figure out what's available to us that allows us an adequate balance of all those traits. And so I want to go through a few things here that kind of give you some notes, and mostly it's what I do. It's what I do. You can take that and look at it and incorporate that into your thought process and your mentality, and try to fit it to your situation. How you think is very important. And how do we want to think? We want to think airplanes, not houses. Now, let's talk about skin. The skin, of course, and again, that's something that I really refer to in this particular book. I call it Skin and Bones Construction, and the idea is you take a thin type material, you back it with a bones type material. So this is the skin, this is the bone. Now, it's been my experience that the skin material can be pretty challenging to find good stuff. What you really want is you want to find a piece of plywood, and what works for me is oak veneer plywood, although birch veneer plywood would work. I noticed that Lowe's has a real nice maple veneer plywood. All of those would work just wonderfully, but they don't have to be veneer. They're also going to be pretty expensive. But what this plywood does is it meets the two of our criteria over here. It looks good, and it's lightweight. A 1/4-inch piece of plywood is as big as you want to go. I'm going to tell you a little secret between you and me. Next year, I'm actually going to make a hybrid box that uses an 1/8-inch piece of plywood. Now, the whole thing won't be 1/8-inch. I'll call it a hybrid box because part of it will be made out of 1/4-inch where it needs to be particularly strong, but parts of it will be made out of 1/8-inch where it doesn't have to have that kind of strength. That's just something that's on the drawing board right now, but I tell that to you because I know some of you guys are designing your own boxes, and don't rule that out. You might find that when you take an 1/8-inch piece of plywood and you back it with a good solid bones material, it forms a strong enough part for you, and that's, of course, the whole object of the game. You want to end up with something that's light yet strong, and when I say strong enough to do what you need. It doesn't have to withstand a nuclear blast per se. You could also use just a standard 1/4-inch piece of plywood. I've actually built chuck boxes out of CDX, which doesn't look particularly good. AB looks quite a bit better. I mean, you could just use standard plywood. Now the trick, though, is you want something that's straight. You don't want a piece of plywood that is bowed. And the main reason you don't want to do that is because of the doors. If you try to make the doors out of plywood that is bowed, what you're going to find is the doors will be bowed and it'll be very difficult to get in and out of the box. The other parts, you can kind of get away with it. You don't have to have such straight plywood for the other parts because the bone materials for the other parts tend to be thicker, and therefore they're better at constricting any bow there might be in the plywood. Now, my favorite material is actually Luan. If you can find a good sheet of Luan. Now, there is a Luan underlayment that they use, which is kind of garbage, very splintery type stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about 5.2 Luan, which really it looks actually quite nice. It's mahogany is what it is. But it's hard to find. I've been able to find it on occasion at Home Depot, but they don't always have it. This particular piece is a combination of Luan on one side and oak on the other side, and this is also a very pretty wood. This also is something that on occasion you can find it at Home Depot, but the funny thing is you go back the next time and won't have it. So the point here is you've got to look around a little bit in order to find something that's suitable to build for your skins. This is what I use right now. It is this is actually called Top Choice, and it's from Lowe's. And it's got oak on both sides. One side is really nice. The other side is, might have some blemishes in it, but that really doesn't affect us too much in the world of chuck boxes. It's actually oak on both sides, so it looks pretty good. It's fairly light. The only trick is you may have to pull the first few sheets off to the side because they invariably will be bowed. And then to get down to one that's straight, that's nice and straight. Anyway, that's kind of the notion with skins material. If you're selective, there are an array of things you can use. I'd say in summary, don't use anything that's over 1/4 of an inch. And actually, to my way of thinking, Baltic birch, although it's very pretty, it's also pretty expensive. It unfortunately is quite heavy. 28 pounds, I think, is what a sheet of 4x8 Baltic birch weighs. And that to me is just pushing the limit. You could do it, but you don't really have to. So why do it? This stuff is about 20 pounds. So it's worth it to me to not have that extra weight. I don't know, you may not have any choice. I wouldn't go to 3/8. I definitely wouldn't go to half. Those just get too heavy. So that's my thoughts on skin materials. Bones, for years I made chuck boxes out of MDF using MDF for the bones material. This stuff comes in an oversized 4x8 sheet. It used to be pretty inexpensive stuff, I think, when I started making chuck boxes. Of course, that was back when the earth was cooling. Pterodactyls ruled the airway. Dinosaurs roamed the earth. It's been a long time ago. I think a sheet of this stuff cost like $8 back then. Maybe it was 12. I don't know, I'm getting old, I can't remember. But anyway, it was actually perfectly adequate as a material to build a chuck box. Now, you do have to consider a couple things. Number one, I live in Arizona. Don't make the mistake of thinking it doesn't rain in Arizona. It does. Sometimes it rains pretty darn hard. But it proved to be just fine. What you got to do is make sure that your glue joints do not get wet or do not soak or sit in water. That's the most important thing, and that's the most important thing whether it's made out of MDF or some other bones material. And the other thing is that you got to make sure that it's finished. Has to be finished. MDF, the nice thing about it is that it's fairly inexpensive. A whole 4x8 sheet of this stuff now is, I noticed, $33. You have enough bones material in one sheet to build every product in the Blue Sky Kitchen with one sheet. So $33 is pretty cheap. Now, what I use is redwood, and that's because I can get it. Now this is 5/8 thick instead of 1/2 inch thick. It comes in a piece that's 5 3/8 inches wide by either 8 or 10 foot long, and it's 5/8 thick. It's very light. Even though it's fatter, it's actually lighter than MDF, I think. Very pretty wood, and really that's why I started using it. The problem with redwood is it is not cheap. In fact, it's probably going to take you about $30 worth of redwood to build just a grubby one. You're not going to build every product in the Blue Sky Kitchen for $30 worth of bones material. You're going to build one product, and that's a big difference. So the expense thing is pretty heavy on redwood. But boy, it sure looks good, and it's plenty strong, and it's very lightweight, so it meets all the other criteria. Now there are other materials, of course. I wouldn't use oak because it's too heavy. I wouldn't, some of the hardwoods are just too heavy to use. I wouldn't use oak or even walnut or any of those kind of things. Now, some of the pines, I think you could get away with it. The trick with using solid woods is that you got to make sure you're really selective. You don't want to use stuff that has warps in it. You don't want to use stuff that has checks and knots. You don't want to use stuff that might warp. You want nice, straight, clear lumber. Now that usually means you have to buy more lumber than you need, and when you cut, you can see which pieces you can use and which pieces you can't. Some pieces you're probably just going to throw away, use them for fire kindling. Other pieces will be fine. The other big advantage to using solid woods is when you need to go dadoing things, putting a rabbit or a dado in something, then it's really easy to do. Solid wood. Now you can still do this with MDF, but I guess I would just say that solid wood tends to work a lot easier than a pressed wood. Now, so there you go. You're the one that's going to have to determine what it is in terms of these qualities that's most important to you. I say lightweight is the most important thing. I say lightweight is the holy grail of chuck boxes. That's my theory, because I camp, and I camp a lot. camp 2 or 3 times a month, not 2 or 3 times a year, and therefore you have to carry this stuff back and forth from house to vehicle, vehicle to campsite, campsite back to vehicle, etc. A lot of times, if you're going to go camping 20, 30 times a year, you have to carry a lot, so lightweight is absolutely paramount. So, all right, that's your skin and bones lecture. Let's move on.